Hello, my name is Daniel. Thank you for being here with me today. If you enjoy real, heartbreaking cheating stories from Reddit, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. It really means a lot to me. This is a story that has weighed on my heart ever since I read it. It is about betrayal, abandonment, and the painful realization that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who push you away when you need them the most. 5 years ago, in the quiet town of Brookhaven, 30-year-old Evelyn's world collapsed. Her husband, Matthew, had been her companion for most of her life. They had grown up together, since their parents had been close friends. And from the outside, their story looked like one of fate and devotion. They dated on and off throughout high school, and by the time she was 23, both families began pressuring them to settle down. Against her instincts, she agreed, thinking love and history would be enough to carry them through a marriage. But as the years unfolded, arguments became routine, and the cracks that had once seemed small grew into canyons she could no longer ignore. Evelyn had long suspected Matthew of being unfaithful. Her suspicions clawed at her quietly for months until one evening, unable to silence the voice inside her, she picked up his phone and scrolled through his messages. There it was. Undeniable proof. He had been having an affair with his receptionist. The casual texts between them read like knives carving into her chest, confirming that the life she thought she had was over. That same night, she left the house. The betrayal was so raw, so unbearable, that her first instinct was to go to her parents' home for comfort. She stood at their door, her hands trembling as she explained what had happened, begging them to let her stay for a few days while she figured out where to go. To her horror, they refused. They told her that Matthew had already called them and admitted the affair, but insisted that one person alone cannot break a marriage. They looked her in the eyes and said it was her fault just as much as his. Even after she begged and cried, they kept the door closed, telling her to work it out with her husband. It wasn't the first time her parents had blamed her. For years, she had confided in them about the growing unhappiness in her marriage. Each time, they brushed her aside, insisting she was too focused on her career, too impatient, too ambitious. They told her she hadn't given her marriage enough time, as if her husband's betrayal was somehow a reflection of her own shortcomings. And when she needed them most, they turned their backs on her completely. Evelyn left their doorstep that night feeling like an orphan, with nowhere else to go. She reached out to her closest friend, Hannah, who opened her home without hesitation. For 2 weeks, Evelyn stayed there, piecing herself together enough to meet with a lawyer, file for divorce, and search for a new apartment. During that time, her parents did not call to ask how she was coping. The only words they ever sent were sharp reminders that she had abandoned her husband, as though she were the one who had broken her vows. Matthew, meanwhile, bombarded her with messages. He apologized endlessly, insisting that marriage counseling would fix everything, as if the act of cheating could be smoothed over with therapy sessions. He begged her not to leave, and her parents sided with him, urging her to forgive and rebuild. But Evelyn's heart had been shattered beyond repair, and she knew she could not return. Once she cut off her parents, they stopped reaching out altogether. The years that followed were quiet, and in many ways, healing. Evelyn built a life for herself far away from the weight of her past. She did not regret cutting ties with her parents. When they crossed paths at the occasional family function, they acted like strangers, and that suited her just fine. Then, 3 years ago, she met Aaron. She had been out with friends one evening at a small restaurant in the city, and he approached her with a warmth that disarmed her instantly. Only later did she learn that he was the owner of the restaurant. And even more surprising, that he came from a family deeply rooted in the culinary world. His father owned one of the largest bakery chains in the state, and Aaron had carried that legacy forward by creating something of his own. Despite his success, what drew Evelyn to him was not his money or status, but his kindness. He treated her with respect, patience, and genuine care, the very things she had been starved of in her marriage. After years of feeling small and blamed, she finally felt seen. Within months, their relationship deepened, and after 3 years together, Aaron asked her to marry him. She said yes without hesitation. Evelyn shared the news of her engagement online, and within days, her parents reappeared in her life. After 5 years of silence, they sent her an email filled with congratulations and hollow apologies. They said they regretted the past and wanted to attend her wedding. But Evelyn could not ignore the timing. Their sudden interest came only after learning of Aaron and his family. And deep down, she knew this was not about love or reconciliation. It was about what they thought they stood to gain. At first, Evelyn thought it was almost reasonable that her parents avoided mentioning Aaron or his family in their first email. But she wasn't naive enough to believe their words were sincere. The timing was far too suspicious. For 5 long years, they had ignored her, and suddenly, right after she announced her engagement, they reappeared. If they truly carried guilt for their actions, they would have reached out long before. The fact that they waited until now told her everything she needed to know. She didn't respond, hoping silence would be enough to keep them away. But it wasn't. A second email arrived just a few days later. This one stripped away the polite mask of their first message. They told her directly that they had looked into Aaron and his family and were proud of her choice. The words left Evelyn sick to her stomach, as if her relationship had been reduced to a strategic move instead of something rooted in love. They praised her for securing a so-called prestigious lineage, as though her engagement were more about wealth and influence than happiness. The arrogance of that email infuriated her. They didn't ask about her healing or her life in the years she'd been gone. They didn't acknowledge the pain they caused when they left her alone on their doorstep all those years ago. Their only interest seemed to be the status of the man she was marrying. That realization stung worse than anything. She blocked them after reading, determined to protect her fragile peace. But that peace didn't last. Evelyn had been living in Aaron's apartment for the past year, and only a handful of people knew the address. So when her parents appeared outside their building one evening, it rattled her to the core. She couldn't imagine how they had found her, and the thought that they had been searching unsettled her deeply. Aaron spotted them first through the window, his jaw tightening instantly. He had heard enough of her past to know how much damage they had caused. When he opened the door, he immediately called for Evelyn to join him. She walked over with dread sitting heavy in her chest. But Aaron reached for her hand, squeezing it as if to say, "You're not alone this time." Her parents started with apologies, saying they didn't want it to look like they cared more about Aaron's wealth than about her forgiveness. They claimed they had wanted to reach out for years but feared she would still be angry with them. Evelyn felt the sadness harden inside her as she listened. Their excuses meant nothing to her now. She told them, with a steady voice, that the way they treated her during her divorce had been unforgivable. Time had not softened the wound, and their presence at her door only reopened it. She asked them to leave. She warned them not to return, or she would have no choice but to contact the police. As she turned to shut the door, her father raised his voice, spitting out words that cut deeper than he realized. He called her arrogant, claiming she was acting superior simply because she was marrying into a wealthy family. Evelyn froze, anger rushing through her veins. She turned back and told him it was never about money, it was about their cruelty. Their inability to stand by her when she needed them most. 5 years had passed, and nothing about them had changed. That was why she refused to let them back into her life. Instead of hearing her, they shifted their attention to Aaron. They told him that her so-called attitude problem had ended her first marriage. And it would end this one too. They reminded him that Matthew had cheated on her with his receptionist. But they framed it as though Evelyn's drive and independence had pushed him into another woman's arms. They boasted that Matthew was now happily married with a child, implying that Evelyn had lost because of her own flaws. The cruelty of those words crushed her. But Aaron didn't waver. He looked them in the eyes and said he didn't need their advice. Whether Evelyn had flaws or not was his business, not theirs. He declared he didn't care about their judgments, because their opinions had no place in their lives. Then, with a calm firmness, he told them something that stunned Evelyn. He said it was almost a relief that Matthew had found love with the woman he betrayed Evelyn with, because it showed just how firmly her parents still stood behind him. Even after all these years, Aaron told them bluntly that their approval meant nothing, because they weren't part of their lives. And with that, he closed the door, leaving her parents outside, rattled and panicked. Eventually, they left. For a moment, Evelyn thought that might be the end of it. But the very next morning, her phone rang. It was her paternal grandparents. And instead of comfort, their voices carried only disappointment. They had heard about the encounter, and they were ready to lecture her. "When the subject of Aaron and my parents came up with my grandparents, I expected them to at least understand why I had kept my distance. After all, they had seen firsthand how strained things had always been between me and my parents. But instead, the moment they heard Erin had mentioned our financial situation, they immediately took my parents' side. It felt like a punch to the chest. They told me I should apologize to my parents, as though everything that had happened between us for decades could be erased with a single word. They insisted that while my parents had made mistakes, they had always tried to give me comfort and support. Maybe on the surface that was true. They put food on the table, gave me clothes, and tried to keep up appearances. But the emotional damage ran deeper than anyone wanted to acknowledge. My grandparents dismissed it all, telling me to be grateful and to stop acting prideful. They reminded me that the wealth we now lived with wasn't mine to boast about, that it came from Erin's family. I explained that it wasn't me flaunting anything, but Erin defending me after my parents' cruel words. Still, they wouldn't hear it. They told me it didn't matter who had said it. What mattered was that I had allowed it to happen. Their words left me humiliated. They accused me of failing to stand up for my parents, as though my silence was some betrayal. I tried to explain that my parents had been vicious to me even in their last visit. But my grandparents dismissed it with a coldness I had never felt from them before. They promised they would speak to my parents separately. But that wasn't the point. I didn't want mediators. I wanted to be heard. The conversation went in circles until I felt trapped and small, like the child I once was, trying to justify why I hurt so much. Before ending the call, my grandparents said something that still stings, that a man who disrespected my family would never truly value me. Then they hung up. Erin had been nothing but loving, and yet their words wormed into my heart, leaving me questioning myself. Was I wrong to let him defend me? Was I cruel for letting my estranged parents' failures be exposed so plainly? When I shared the comments with Erin later that evening, he shook his head with conviction. He told me he wouldn't apologize to anyone who had insulted me repeatedly, no matter what they believed they deserved. He reminded me that even during their last visit, my parents tried to belittle me, painting me as arrogant simply because I refused to bend to them. He told me again that from the stories I had shared and from what he had seen himself, they were not people who deserved forgiveness. Still, my grandparents' sudden change left me uneasy. For years, they had remained neutral, refusing to intervene whenever I cried to them about my parents. They would tell me I needed to sort it out myself. That neutrality, I now realized, wasn't kindness. It was convenience. They wanted peace, not truth. They kept me at arm's length, only stepping in when their son, my father, was embarrassed. Erin reminded me of that, pointing out that their loyalty had always been selective. They were silent when I hurt, but loud when my parents felt slighted. His anger on my behalf comforted me in ways I hadn't expected. He even told me it was endearing how defensive he felt, how much he wanted to shield me from all of it. And for a moment, I believed him fully. I wanted to. But then another call came. A week later. This time, my grandparents said I had been wrong. They claimed they had reflected and wanted to apologize. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I let the silence sit heavy between us until they eventually hung up. A few days after that, when I thought it was over, a new email appeared. They had created another account, desperate to reach me after I blocked them. The message was long, filled with disappointment in how I had handled everything. They claimed they had always been on my side during the last 5 years, though I could not remember a single time they truly chose me over my parents. They admitted that their diplomatic stance was simply the easiest path for them. Reading those words, I felt a mix of grief and resignation. They had never truly been my allies. They wanted me to fold back into a family that had wounded me for years, to accept hurt in exchange for keeping the peace. And I realized, sitting there with Erin's hand over mine, that peace built on silence was never peace at all. When the email arrived, it was nothing more than a repetition of the same accusations I had grown tired of hearing. They claimed they had made a mistake in the past, but insisted that deep down my parents were right all along, that I had always carried an attitude problem that needed fixing. The words were empty, just recycled judgments, their own criticisms now mirroring the same unsubstantiated claims my parents had thrown at me for years. It stung because they had once told me that both my parents and I had valid but different perspectives, that no one could be declared entirely right or wrong. Yet now, instead of trying to bridge the gap, they had chosen to make it personal. lashing out without reason. I showed the email to Charlie, and his face hardened the moment he finished reading. He told me he was relieved we had never sent an apology. Never reached out again, because people like that didn't deserve reconciliation. To him, they were greedy, clinging to some warped sense of control over me, unwilling to see that the problem was theirs, not mine. I didn't reply. I couldn't. In my heart, I already knew there was nothing left to salvage. They had turned me into the villain. And once someone wears that mask, nothing they say will ever be taken at face value. They would always find another excuse, another reason to place blame on me. Perhaps what frightened them most was not losing me, but losing what they could have gained from my marriage to Charlie. The irony was bitter. Charlie and I had always believed that if they truly wanted forgiveness, they could have chosen kindness. Instead, resentment had poisoned everything. Maybe they knew that. Maybe they didn't care. Either way, I told myself they were no longer a part of my life. 2 months slipped by. I buried myself in wedding plans, in the small joys of choosing flowers, writing vows, and imagining a day that would finally belong only to me and Charlie. I had almost forgotten about the weight of my parents' shadow, until 3 days ago when I saw them outside my apartment again. Charlie wasn't home this time. My stomach dropped, a knot of dread coiling inside me. Through the door, I told them I wasn't willing to argue again. I warned them to leave or I'd call the police, even though the thought of making that call felt like a wound deeper than I could handle. But they didn't leave. Instead, my father spoke, his voice softer than I remembered. He said he didn't expect me to forgive or welcome them back into my life, but he wanted me to hear his apology. He admitted they had made everything worse by refusing to accept that I wasn't ready to forgive. Now, after long consideration, he wanted me to know he was sorry. My mother's voice broke as she added that they would wait the rest of their lives for my forgiveness if that's what it took. Those words pierced me in a way I wasn't prepared for. My hand trembled as I opened the door. I told them I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to feel. I only knew I wasn't ready. I asked them not to apologize anymore, because it was too heavy for me to carry. I told them I needed time. Years maybe, and perhaps one day I might reach out. I don't know if I will, but I said it anyway, just to soften the moment. My mother wept. She admitted that she and my father had been too proud, too blind to see their own failings as parents. After my divorce, they had let themselves believe lies about me, convinced that my flaws explained everything. Sometimes they thought I was right. Sometimes they thought Nick was. And their treatment of me shifted like sand, leaving me without solid ground. But none of that mattered. I am their daughter. My personality, my pain, should never have been a mystery to them. They had chosen not to know me, and that choice wasn't mine to bear. I told them plainly that if they wanted any hope of forgiveness, they needed to stay away and let me heal. They nodded quietly, then left without another word. When Charlie returned home, I explained everything. He listened carefully, then said things could have been worse, and for that we should be thankful. Still, my heart felt heavy, torn between sorrow and numbness. I tried not to dwell on it. My wedding was close, and I needed to keep my focus there. Last week, Charlie and I finally got married. For one night, surrounded by laughter and the warmth of friends, I let myself believe in happiness again. My family wasn't there, of course. Their absence was a shadow over the celebration, a reminder of the ache I carry. Even on the brightest of days, the day of my wedding came quietly, without the chaos or large celebrations that most people imagine. Because my parents were never meant to attend, the guest list was small. I invited my maternal grandparents, but they lived several states away, and my grandfather's failing health made the trip impossible. A handful of relatives showed up, but the room still felt half empty. And yet, when I looked at Elias, everything else seemed bearable. His family welcomed me as though I had always belonged, folding me into their lives without hesitation. That kindness was something I had never truly known before, and I clung to it with gratitude. 2 days after the ceremony, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, I immediately recognized my parents' voices. They admitted they had heard about the wedding through my cousins, even though I had deliberately kept them away. They claimed to be thrilled for me, offering blessings and good wishes as if nothing had ever happened. I listened in silence, then offered a polite thank you before ending the call. There was nothing left to say. Some people might argue that I should never have allowed my parents into my home during their last visit. Others would insist that I should have involved the police, cutting them off more forcefully. But deep inside, I knew that such actions would only feed their anger and prolong the cycle of resentment. I have learned to prefer distance without conflict. Neutrality feels like the safest ground. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but also not open hostility. I don't believe I will ever rebuild closeness with my parents. Too much has been broken, too much left unsaid, and too many wounds have scarred over. Yet I have also come to understand that some relationships are not meant to be repaired, no matter how much we wish otherwise. In this silence, in this carefully chosen separation, I find a fragile peace. And perhaps that is enough for now. This story is not only about betrayal and loss but also about survival and the quiet strength it takes to walk away from toxic bonds. In real life, many people face similar situations where family members or partners become sources of pain instead of support. One of the hardest lessons to learn is that love does not excuse cruelty. And blood ties do not obligate us to accept abuse. If you find yourself in a toxic relationship, whether it's with parents, a partner, or even a close friend, remember that distance can be a form of self-preservation. It does not make you ungrateful or weak to protect yourself. Setting boundaries is not about punishing the other person. It's about preserving your own well-being. Neutrality, as in this story, can sometimes be more powerful than confrontation. It allows you to step out of the cycle of constant hurt while keeping your dignity intact. Practical steps include recognizing patterns early. Gaslighting, manipulation, or conditional affection are major red flags. Documenting incidents, leaning on trusted friends, or seeking professional counseling can give you clarity and strength. Above all, never feel guilty for choosing peace over chaos. Life after trauma is not about erasing the past but about building a future where you feel safe, valued, and free to heal. And sometimes, that begins with the simplest but most difficult choice: walking away.